Right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Mr. West Reads the Twits, Part 1. If you don't know this book, this is a book by Roald Dahl, and I've chose this book because this was a book that my dad used to read to me all the time when I was probably your age. So I thought I would read it for you if you have not read it. It's a really funny book. So I think I'll read about half an hour of it, and I can see that some people are logging in already. So just give it about 30 more seconds, and then we will start to read the book just to see if anyone else joins us. So while we wait, here's the book cover, so you can start having a little bit of a look at that, and I will read you what it says in the back, and then you can start thinking what the story might be about. So, Mr. and Mrs. Twig are twits. They are also extremely nasty. So the Muggle monkeys and the roly-poly bird hatch an ingenious plan to give them just the ghastly surprise they deserve. There's a picture of the Muggle monkeys on the back. So we are a couple of minutes past 10, so we will start the book. Chapter 1. Hairy Faces. What a lot of hairy-faced men there are around nowadays. When a man grows hair all over his face, it is impossible to tell what he really looks like. Perhaps that's why he does it. He'd rather you didn't know. Then there's the problem of washing. When the very hairy ones wash their faces, it must be as big a job as when you and I wash the hair on our heads. So, what I want to know is this: how often do all these hairy-faced men wash their faces? Is it only once a week, like us, on Sunday nights? And do they shampoo it? Do they use a hairdryer? Do they rub hair tonic in to stop their faces from going bald? Do they go to a barber to have their hairy faces cut and trimmed, or do they do it themselves in front of the bathroom mirror with nail scissors? I don't know. But the next time you see a man with a hairy face, which will probably be as soon as you step out onto the street, maybe you will look at him more closely and start wondering about some of these things. Mr. Twig. So here's a picture of Mr. Twit. Mr. Twit. Mr. Twit was one of those hairy-faced men. The whole of his face, except for his forehead, his eyes and his nose, was covered in thick hair. The stuff even sprouted in revolting tufts out of his nostrils and ear holes. Mr. Twit felt that his hairiness made him look terrifically wise and grand, but in truth he was neither of these things. Mr. Twit was a twit. He was born a twit, and now at the age of 60 he was a bigger twit than ever. The hair on Mr. Twit's face didn't grow smooth and matted as it does on most hairy-faced men. It grew in spikes that stuck out straight like the bristles of a nail brush. And how often did Mr. Twit wash this bristly, nail-brushy face of his? The answer is never. Not even on Sundays. He hadn't washed it for years. Dirty beards. As you know, an ordinary unhairy face, like yours or mine, simply gets a bit smudgy if it is not washed often enough. And there's nothing so awful about that. But a hairy face is a different matter. Things cling to hairs, especially food. Things like gravy go right in among the hairs and stay there. You and I can wipe our smooth faces with a flannel, and we can quickly look more or less like right again. But the hairy men cannot do that. We can also, if we are careful, eat our meals without spreading food all over our faces. But not so the hairy man. Watch carefully next time you see a hairy man eating his lunch, and you will notice that even if he opens his mouth very wide, it is impossible for him to get a spoonful of beef stew or ice cream and chocolate sauce into it without leaving some of it on the hairs. Mr. Twit didn't even bother to open his mouth wide when he ate. As a result, and because he never washed, there were always hundreds of bits of old breakfasts and lunches and suppers sticking to the hairs around his face. They weren't big bits, mind you. because he used to wipe those off with the back of his hand or on his sleeve while he was eating. But if you look closely, not that you'd ever want to, you would see tiny little specks of dried up scrambled eggs stuck to the hairs, and spinach and tomato ketchup and fish fingers and minced chicken livers and all the other disgusting things that Mr Twig liked to eat. And here's a picture, look. So here are some cornflakes and some tinned sardines and some Stilton cheese. And this is obviously Mr Twig's mouth and his beard with all the food stuck in. Gross. If you look closer still, hold your noses, ladies and gentlemen. If you peered deep into the moustachy bristles sticking out over his upper lip, you would probably see much larger objects that had escaped the wipe of his hand. Things that had been there for months and months, like pieces of maggoty green cheese or a moulded cornflake, or even the slimy tail of a tinned sardine. Because of all this, Mr Twig never went really hungry. By sticking his tongue out and curling it sideways to explore the hairy jungle around his mouth, he was always able to find a tasty morsel here and there to nibble on. What I am trying to tell you is that Mr Twig was a foul and smelly old man. He was also an extremely horrid old man, as you will find out in a moment. Mrs Twig. Here's a picture of Mrs Twig. Mrs Twig. Mrs Twig was no better than her husband. She did not, of course, have a hairy face. It was a pity she didn't, because that at any rate would have hidden some of her fearful ugliness. Take a look at her. Have you ever seen a woman with an uglier face than that? I doubt it. But the funny thing is that Mrs Twig wasn't born ugly. She had had quite a nice face when she was young. The ugliness had grown upon her year by year as she got older. Why would that happen? I'll tell you why. If a person has ugly thoughts, it begins to show on the face. And when that person has ugly thoughts every day, every week, every year, the face gets uglier and uglier until it gets so ugly you can hardly bear to look at it. A person who has good thoughts cannot ever be ugly. You can have a wonky nose and a crooked mouth and a double chin and stick out teeth, but if you have good thoughts, they will shine out of your face like sunbeams and you will always look lovely. And here's some pictures. So this is Mrs Twig getting uglier and uglier. And then this is someone with a big nose and sticky out teeth, which looks lovely because she's having good thoughts. If a person has ugly thoughts, it begins to show on the face. Oh, I'm reading the same page again. Next page. Nothing shone out of Mrs Twig's face. In her right hand she carried a walking stick. She used to tell people that this was because she had warts growing on the sole of her left foot, and walking was painful. But the real reason that she carried a stick was so that she could hit things with it. Things like dogs and cats and small children. And then there was the glass eye. Mrs Twig had a glass eye that was always looking the other way. Next chapter, the glass eye. You can play a lot of tricks with a glass eye because you can take it out and pop it back in again anytime you like. You can bet your life Mrs Twig knew all the tricks. One morning, she took out her glass eye and dropped it into Mr Twig's mug of beer when he wasn't looking. Mr Twig sat there drinking the beer slowly. The froth made a white ring on the hairs around his mouth. He wiped the white froth onto his sleeve and wiped his sleeve on his trousers. You're plotting something, Mrs Twig said, keeping her back turned so he wouldn't see that she'd taken out her glass eye. Whenever you go all quiet like that, I know very well you're plotting something. Mrs Twig was right. Mr Twig was plotting away like mad. He was trying to think up a really nasty trick that he could play on his wife that day. You'd better be careful, Mrs Twig said, because when I see you starting to plot, I watch you like a wombat. Oh, do shut up, you old hag, Mr Twit said. He went on drinking his beer, and his evil mind kept working away on the latest horrid trick he was going to play on the old woman. Suddenly, as Mr Twit tipped the last drop of beer down his throat, he caught sight of Mrs Twit's awful glass eyes staring up at him from the bottom of the mug. It made him jump. I told you I was watching you, cackled Mrs Twit. I've got eyes everywhere, so you'd better be careful. Next chapter. The Frog. To pay her back for the glass eye in his beer, Mr Twit decided he would put a frog in Mrs Twit's bed. He caught a big one down by the pond and carried it back secretly in a box. That night, when Mrs Twit was in the bathroom getting ready for bed, Mr Twit slipped the frog between her sheets. Then he got into his own bed and waited for the fun to begin. Mrs Twit came back and climbed into her bed and put out the light. She lay there in the dark, scratching her tummy. Her tummy was itching. Dirty old hags like her always have itchy tummies. Then all at once, she felt something cold and slimy crawling over her feet. She screamed. What's the matter with you? Mr Twit said. Help! Screamed Mrs Twit, bouncing about. There's something in my bed. I'll bet it's that giant skillywiggler I saw on the floor just now, Mr Twit said. That what? Screamed Mrs Twit. I tried to kill it, but it got away, Mr Twit said. It's got teeth like screwdrivers. Help! Screamed Mrs Twit. Save me! It's all over my feet. It'll bite off your toes, said Mr Twit. Mrs Twit fainted. Mr Twit got out of bed and fetched a jug of cold water. He poured the water over Mrs Twit's head to revive her. The frog crawled up from underneath the sheets to get near the water. It started jumping about on the pillow. Frogs love water. This one was having a good time. When Mrs Twit came to, the frog had just jumped onto her face. This is not a nice thing to happen to anyone in bed at night. She screamed again. By golly, it is a giant skillywiggler, said Mr Twit. It'll bite off your nose. Mrs Twit leapt out of bed and flew downstairs and spent the night on the sofa. The frog went to sleep on her pillow. Here's some pictures of that. There's the frog asleep on the pillow. There's Mrs Twit with it on her face. The frog on her face. Next chapter. The wormy spaghetti. The next day, to pay Mr Twit back for the frog trick, Mrs Twit sneaked out into the garden and dug up some worms. She chose big long ones and put them in a tin and carried the tin back to the house under her apron. At 1 o'clock, she cooked spaghetti for lunch and she mixed the worms in with the spaghetti, but only on her husband's plate. The worms didn't show because everything was covered in tomato sauce and sprinkled with cheese. Hey, my spaghetti's moving, cried Mr Twit, poking around in it with his fork. It's a new kind, Mrs Twit said, taking a mouthful of her own plate, which of course had no worms. It's called squiggly spaghetti. It's delicious. Eat up while it's nice and hot. Mr Twit started eating, twisting the long tomato sauce covered strings around his fork and shoveling them into his mouth. Soon there was tomato sauce all over his hairy chin. It's not as good as the ordinary kind, he said, talking with his mouth full. It's too squishy. I find it very tasty, Mrs Twit said. She was watching him from the other end of the table. It gave her great pleasure to watch him eating the worms. I find it rather bitter, Mr Twit said. It's got a distinctly bitter flavour. Buy the other kind this time. Mrs Twit waited until Mr Twit had eaten the whole plateful. Then she said, Do you want to know why your spaghetti was so squishy? Mr Twit wiped the tomato sauce from his beard with a corner of the tablecloth. Why? He said. And why it had a nasty bitter taste? Why? He said. Because it was worms, cried Mrs Twit, clapping her hands and stamping her feet on the floor and rocking with horrible laughter. Next chapter, the funny walking stick. To pay Mrs Twig back for the worms in his spaghetti, Mr Twig thought up a really clever, nasty trick. One night, when the old woman was asleep, he crept out of bed and took her walking stick downstairs to his work shed. There he stuck a tiny piece of wood, no thicker than a penny, on the bottom of the stick. This made the stick a little longer, but the difference was so small, the next morning Mrs Twig didn't notice it. The following night, Mr Twig stuck on another bit of tiny wood. Every night he crept downstairs and added an extra tiny thickness of wood to the end of the walking stick. He did it very neatly, so that the extra bits looked like a part of the old stick. Gradually, but oh so gradually, Mrs Twig's walking stick was getting longer and longer. Now, when something is growing very slowly, it is almost impossible to notice it happening. You yourself, for example, are actually growing taller every day that goes by, but you wouldn't think it, would you? It's happening so slowly you can't even notice it from one week to the next. It was the same with Mrs Twig's walking stick. It was all so slow and gradual that he didn't notice how long it was getting, even when it was halfway up to her shoulder. "That stick's too long for you," Mr Twig said to her one day. "Why, so it is," Mrs Twig said, looking at the stick. "I've had a feeling there was something wrong, but I couldn't for the life of me think what it was." "There's something wrong, all right," Mr Twig said, beginning to enjoy himself. "What can have happened?" Mrs Twig said, staring at her old walking stick. "It must suddenly have grown longer." "Don't be a fool," Mr Twig said. "How can a walking stick possibly grow longer? It's made of dead wood, isn't it? Dead wood can't grow." "Then what on earth has happened?" cried Mrs Twig. "It's not the stick, it's you," said Mr Twig, grinning horribly. "It's you that's getting shorter. I've been noticing it for some time now." "That's not true," cried Mrs Twig. "You're shrinking, woman," said Mr Twig. It's not possible," said Mrs Twig. "Oh yes, it jolly well is. You're shrinking fast. You're shrinking dangerously fast. Why, you must have shrunk at least a foot in the last few days." "Never!" she cried. "Of course you have. Take a look at your stick, you old goat, and see how much you've shrunk in comparison. You've got the shrinks. That's what you've got. You've got the dreaded shrinks." Mrs Twig began to feel so trembly she had to sit down. Mrs Twig has the shrinks. As soon as Mrs Twig sat down, Mr Twig pointed at her and shouted, "There you are! You're sitting in your old chair and you've shrunk so much, your feet aren't even touching the ground." Mrs Twig looked down at her feet, and by golly, the man was right. Her feet were not touching the ground. Mr Twig, you see, had been just as clever with the chair as he'd been with the walking stick. Every night, when he had gone downstairs and stuck a little bit extra on the stick, he had done the same to the four legs of Mrs Twig's chair. "Just look at you sitting there in your same old chair," he cried, "and you've shrunk so much your feet are dangling in the air." Mrs Twig went white with fear. "You've got the shrinks!" cried Mr Twig, pointing his finger at her like a pistol. "You've got them badly. You've got the most terrible case of the shrinks I've ever seen." Mrs Twig became so frightened she began to dribble. But Mr Twig, still remembering the worms in his spaghetti, didn't feel sorry for her at all. "I suppose you know what happens to you when you get the shrinks," he said. "What?" gasped Mrs Twig. "What happens?" "Your head shrinks into your neck, and your neck shrinks into your body, and your body shrinks into your legs, and your legs shrink into your feet, and in the end there's nothing left except a pair of shoes and a bundle of old clothes." "I can't bear it," cried Mrs Twig. "It's a terrible disease," said Mr Twig. "The worst in the world." "How long have I got?" cried Mrs Twig. "How long before I finish up as a bundle of old clothes and a pair of shoes?" Mr Twig put on a very solemn face. At the rate you're going, he said, shaking his head sadly, I'd say we've not got more than 10 or 11 days. But is there anything we can do? Cried Mrs Twig. There's only one quick cure for the shrinks, said Mr Twig. Tell me, she cried. Oh, tell me quickly. We'll have to hurry, said Mr Twig. I'm ready. I'll hurry. I'll do anything you say, cried Mrs Twit. You won't last long if you don't, said Mr Twig, giving her another grisly grin. What is it I must do? Cried Mrs Twig, clutching her cheeks. You've got to be stretched, said Mr Twit. Right, we're going to leave it there for today. The letter we sent out, we said we'd do this every Monday, but actually I think we could just do it every day, and so you guys can log in, and we've got plenty to go on the Twits, and then I've got lots of other Roald Dahl books as well and some other books. So we'll log in every day at about 10 o'clock, and we'll do about 20 minutes of reading. And then if you guys want to, your parents have got our email addresses, so you can email us and ask us any questions you want, or if there are any books that you want me to read, you can do that as well. Email and ask for books, and I'll try and read them. Okay, so I hope you are all okay. I hope you're all staying safe and getting some exercise. And remember, if you need to get in touch with us, ask your parents to email us. Okay, and we'll be back here tomorrow at 10 o'clock. Okay, guys, take care. We'll see you soon. Bye.